On the 23rd of April, 2006, the British Secretary of State for Defense stood before reporters in Kabul and made a promise that would become the most catastrophically misjudged statement in the history of the Afghan war. John Reed looked into the cameras and said, with complete confidence, that British soldiers would be perfectly happy to leave Afghanistan in 3 years without firing one shot. 8 weeks later, 25 British soldiers were surrounded in a crumbling compound in northern Helmand, running out of food, running out of water, and running out of ammunition, facing 500 Taliban fighters who attacked them 26 days out of 56. By the time it was over, 3 soldiers were dead from the garrison itself. 3 more had been killed in a failed relief attempt. A quarter of the British Army's entire annual ammunition allocation for Afghanistan had been consumed, and some of the men inside that compound had quietly set aside a final bullet for themselves rather than fall into Taliban hands. The Ministry of Defense classified the details for years. Active duty soldiers were prohibited from speaking about it. Tell me in the comments, have you ever heard of Easy Company and the siege of Musa Qala before today? Because what you are about to discover will make you question everything you thought you knew about how Britain went to war. Now let's go. To understand how 88 British soldiers ended up in that position, you must first understand what Helmand province actually was, and why the British arrived so catastrophically unprepared for the reality waiting for them there. The surface version of events is straightforward enough. Following the September 11th attacks, Britain deployed to Afghanistan as part of the NATO-led coalition, the mission evolving over several years from the destruction of Al-Qaeda into the stabilization of a country shattered by 3 decades of continuous war. By 2006, the Taliban had regrouped across southern Afghanistan, conducting a sophisticated insurgency that the initial intervention had failed to extinguish. The International Security Assistance Force expanded its mandate to include the restive southern provinces, and Helmand became the responsibility of a primarily British formation designated Task Force Helmand. The British sent 3,300 soldiers. The mission was described as reconstruction. The timeline was 3 years. Neither description survived contact with the reality on the ground. Helmand was not a failed state that needed fixing. It was a functioning system operating by its own logic, a logic that had defeated every foreign power that tried to impose an alternative across several centuries of attempts. The province was the spiritual and agricultural heartland of the Pashtun South, dominated by the Alizai tribe and subdivided into 6 rival clans whose competition for land, water, and authority had continued without resolution across generations. Its economy ran on opium. Helmand was responsible for more than half of Afghanistan's entire poppy production. And the poppy was not merely a drug crop, but the foundation of an economic ecosystem supporting farmers, traders, tribal militias, corrupt officials, and insurgents in equal measure. To disrupt the opium was to attack the financial base of almost every significant power structure in the province simultaneously. The British arrived with a mandate to do exactly that, and with 3,300 soldiers to do it against a population and a landscape that had absorbed larger armies than theirs without changing in any fundamental way. The trouble began before a single soldier landed. The previous governor of Helmand, Sher Mohammed Akhundzada, had been discovered at his provincial headquarters with 9 metric tons of raw opium. His links to the drug trade were documented. His links to the insurgency were suspected. The British insisted he be removed from power, and he was. His replacement, a technocrat named Mohammed Daoud, was a competent administrator with no local constituency, no tribal base, and no capacity to fill the space Akhundzada had occupied. The militias that had kept the Taliban out of Helmand's key population centers under Akhundzada's authority became inactive overnight. The Taliban, who had watched this sequence of events from their sanctuaries across the Pakistani border, understood immediately what the vacancy meant. They moved to fill it before the British had finished unpacking their equipment. 3 years before the deployment, in 2003, Akhundzada's militia had raided a village called Akhtak in Bagran district, where insurgents were sheltering. 80 people died, the majority of them civilians. The governor promised compensation to the families of the dead. He never paid it. Promises of reconstruction that followed from the Karzai government were similarly abandoned. The tribesmen of northern Helmand, who had initially accepted the new order with cautious optimism, watched promise after promise dissolve into corruption and neglect. This single accumulated pattern of betrayal had done more to rehabilitate the Taliban in the minds of northern Helmand's population than any amount of religious propaganda could have achieved. The people of Musa Qala had not been Taliban supporters in 2001. They had struck their own arrangement with the insurgents, convincing them not to conduct guerrilla warfare in their area. For several years, this held. The cascade of broken promises beginning in 2003 dismantled it piece by piece until there was nothing left to dismantle. And by 2006, the Taliban had not merely returned to the Musa Qala area. They had been invited back by men who felt they had no other option. The town of Musa Qala sits on the banks of its river in the northern reaches of the province. Its name translates from Pashto as the Fortress of Moses, and the name is not decorative. The place possesses a quality of absolute territorial logic, with desert on 3 sides, the green zone of its river valley providing water and cover, and mountains at its back, providing sanctuary for anyone who needed to disappear. Between 15,000 and 20,000 people lived there, almost entirely Alizai Pashtun, and the 6 clans of the Alizai had been managing their own affairs, fighting their own feuds, and rejecting outside authority for as long as anyone in the region could remember. Into this world, in the spring of 2006, arrived the soldiers of the British Army with their reconstruction mandate, their 3-year timeline, and their catastrophically optimistic assessment of what they would find. The 3rd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, 3 Para, formed the core of the battle group sent to Helmand. 3 Para was one of the most battle-hardened infantry formations in the British Army. Veterans of the Falklands, Northern Ireland, the Balkans, and Iraq. They arrived expecting a counterinsurgency campaign weighted toward governance support and reconstruction, perhaps punctuated by occasional engagements with insurgent groups. What awaited them was something closer to conventional war fought by unconventional means across a province the size of a small country. Within weeks of their arrival, the battle group was simultaneously engaged in intense fighting at Sangin, Nauzad, and Kajaki, a dispersal of effort across distances and terrain that stretched the force to its absolute limit. The soldiers of 3 Para were fighting on 3 fronts at once, and the resources available to cover all 3 fronts were not sufficient for any of them. It was precisely because 3 Para's resources were so heavily committed elsewhere that the events at Musa Qala unfolded the way they did, with consequences that would echo for 15 years. On the 18th of May, 2006, 25 days after Reid's press conference in Kabul, Taliban insurgents attacked the Afghan National Police compound in Musa Qala, killing 20 officers. The British Pathfinder platoon was deployed to stabilize the situation. They stayed 5 days and left. On the 14th of June, they were ordered back to a town that had grown considerably more dangerous in the weeks since their first visit. Major Nick White Boycott commanded the Pathfinder platoon, and the unit he led was one of the most specialized in the British Army. Not a garrison force, not an infantry company designed to hold ground under sustained attack, but a mobile long-range reconnaissance element whose entire doctrine was built around speed, movement, and the avoidance of fixed engagement. 25 men, trained to operate deep in denied territory in small groups, gathering intelligence and withdrawing before the enemy could identify their position and mass against them. They carried their equipment in Land Rover weapons, platform vehicles, and Pinzgauer four-wheel drive trucks. They were built for mobility, not fortification. They were extraordinary soldiers, doing extraordinary work in the environment they had been designed for. They were precisely the wrong unit for what was about to happen to them. The Musa Qala district center was a cluster of low cement and mud brick buildings enclosed within a 10-foot perimeter wall, positioned not on high ground, not on defensible terrain at the edge of the settlement, but in the center of a densely populated urban environment, where every surrounding building, every alleyway, and every rooftop represented a potential firing position for an enemy who had grown up navigating those streets and knew every angle of approach and every shadow. Inside the compound stood a police headquarters, a prison, and a clinic built by American forces in an earlier and more optimistic phase of the intervention. The Pathfinders moved into the compound's central building and began improving the defenses, constructing 3 sangars, the improvised fortified observation posts that a garrison builds when it expects to need them urgently. One on the roof of their building, one facing east toward the market where the civilian population moved through their daily lives, one on a structure just outside the compound walls. On the roof of the prison, the tallest structure in the district center, and the one building from which the surrounding rooftops could be observed, they mounted a heavy Browning .50 caliber machine gun. Within days, the soldiers had given the prison its name. They called it the Alamo. Those who knew their history understood immediately why. Those who did not understand, quickly enough. Sharing the compound were 80 Afghan national police officers under the command of a man known throughout Musa Qala, to the British soldiers, to the townspeople, and to the Taliban fighters surrounding the compound by the nickname Coco. Abdul Wuli had been fighting in Afghanistan for 30 years, across every phase of the conflict, on sides that had shifted with the political weather of each decade. He had been Taliban. He was now police. He maintained regular communication with insurgent commanders operating in the area around the town, not necessarily from disloyalty to the coalition forces he nominally served, but because in a place like Musa Qala, knowing what your enemy was planning and where they were moving was a survival skill that predated any concept of allegiance to an outside power. His officers were undisciplined, frequently accused by the local population of theft and abuse, and chronically slack about their formal duties. They were also, the Pathfinders observed with something approaching grudging respect, thoroughly willing to fight when the moment came. The relationship between the British soldiers and their Afghan counterparts in that compound was one of the more complex human arrangements the siege produced, built on mutual necessity and mutual suspicion in roughly equal measure. The plan was to hold the district center until A Company, 3 Para, could arrive and relieve the Pathfinders. A company was already fighting its way through intense Taliban resistance around Sangin and could not be extracted without consequences elsewhere that the battle group commander could not afford. A few days became a few weeks. The Pathfinders settled into the compound and tried to make the best of a situation that was deteriorating around them with each passing day. What they could not know was that the Taliban command structure in northern Helmand had already assessed the compound's tactical vulnerabilities, counted the defenders visible from the surrounding buildings, calculated the resupply problem posed by the lack of a secure ground route, and begun moving fighters toward Musa Qala from the villages and desert camps where they had been gathering since the British arrived in the province. 2 weeks after the Pathfinders returned to the compound, an American convoy was ambushed in the green zone on the town's outskirts. The American response was everything that their military doctrine prescribed: a strategic bomber, Apache attack helicopters, and a storm of precision firepower that eliminated the immediate threat with the brutal efficiency of a force that had not been told to hold back. The local population, watching from their homes and from the rooftops of the buildings surrounding the compound, drew their own conclusions and began to leave. Women gathered children and possessions. Shopkeepers shuttered their premises. Within days, the once populated streets around the district center were largely empty. British intelligence reached its own conclusion from the same evidence. The Taliban had encircled the district center. The 6-day mission had entered its 4th week, and the options available to the Pathfinders had just narrowed considerably. At 1 o'clock in the morning on the 17th of July, 2006, the defenders of the Musa Qala district center picked up movement through their night vision devices. Figures approaching the compound through the darkness, moving with the deliberate caution of men who knew exactly where the observation posts were and exactly how close they could get before they would be seen. Then the first rocket-propelled grenade struck the compound wall, followed immediately by 3 or 4 more. A carefully coordinated volley designed to suppress the sentries on the sangars, while fighters moved into prepared firing positions in the surrounding buildings. Small arms fire crackled from multiple directions simultaneously, filling the air above the compound with rounds and forcing the defenders to keep their heads down while the Taliban moved. The Pathfinders returned fire with their rifles, machine guns, and light mortars, pouring rounds back into the darkness toward muzzle flashes and the sounds of movement. White Boycott called for an artillery strike on a building near the compound wall, where a significant concentration of insurgents had taken cover. The shells struck. The structure was heavily damaged, and a significant number of Taliban were killed. The building turned out to be a mosque. The extraordinary complications of fighting an insurgency embedded in a civilian population, in a culture where the destruction of a religious site carried consequences far beyond the tactical, had arrived in Musa Qala on the very first night of serious engagement. The Taliban came back 2 nights later, probing the defenses rather than launching a full assault, testing the garrison's reaction times and mapping the fields of fire of each sangar. Artillery and the presence of NATO aircraft overhead deterred a full attack on that occasion. After that second night, the Taliban did not leave. They settled permanently into the surrounding buildings and rooftops and alleyways and began the methodical, patient business of making the district center their primary target. A Danish light reconnaissance squadron, 140 men in armored vehicles, departed Camp Bastion on the 21st of July to drive into Musa Qala from the west and relieve the garrison. The Pathfinders, watching through their observation posts, spotted Taliban fighters regrouping between the approaching Danish column and the town and directed a ground attack aircraft onto the insurgent positions. The Taliban had prepared their ambush with more care than a single airstrike could disrupt. They blocked the road with barrels and struck the Danish column simultaneously from 3 sides. One of the armored vehicles detonated a mine buried in the road surface. 3 crew were wounded. The column commander ordered his force back into the desert. There would be no relief today. The garrison had run out of food. They had run out of water and were reduced to drinking goat's milk, bartered from the few remaining townspeople still willing to approach the compound walls. Ammunition stocks were dropping. The batteries for the night vision devices were exhausted, which meant the hours between midnight and dawn, the window the Taliban preferred for their heaviest attacks, would have to be defended with naked eyes and the trained instincts of men who knew only roughly what was waiting for them in the darkness outside. The mathematics of the situation were not complicated, and every man in the compound had done them. And on the 24th of July, the Taliban launched the largest assault yet attempted against the position. 300 fighters attacking from every direction simultaneously, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the garrison through sheer weight of numbers and fire. The attack opened with a rocket-propelled grenade strike that obliterated one of the compound's 3 sangars in a single detonation, removing an entire observation and firing position from the defensive perimeter in an instant. In the chaos of fire and smoke and shouting that followed, a Danish soldier fell outside the compound wall. He was in the killing ground, between the wall and the surrounding buildings. In the dark, under fire from 300 men, unable to get back inside on his own. Private Mark Wilson saw it happen, assessed the situation in the time it takes to draw a single breath, and did not wait for an order. There was no ladder anywhere in the compound. Wilson found an old bedstead, a rusted metal bed frame left by some previous occupant of the district center in calmer times, and leaned it against the 10-foot wall. He climbed it under direct enemy fire. He reached the injured Dane. He hauled him back over the parapet with his own hands, with rounds snapping past him and fragments throwing dust from the wall around him, while 300 Taliban fighters were actively and specifically working to kill anyone who appeared above that wall. Mark Wilson was later awarded the Military Cross for what he did with that bed frame. Air support took 90 minutes to arrive after the assault began. For 90 minutes, the compound held on nothing but the rifles and the courage of the men inside it, and one piece of improvised furniture found in a corner of the courtyard. On the 26th of July, after coalition aircraft had dropped 6 1,000-pound bombs on Taliban positions throughout the area surrounding the town, the Danish column made its second attempt and succeeded in breaking through to the compound. During the link-up in the confusion of the approaching vehicles and the aftermath of the bombardment, a Pathfinder sergeant was accidentally shot by an Afghan National Police Guard. But the Danes were through the wire. The Pathfinders, 52 days in the field, with the last 3 weeks of that spent under sustained daily attack in conditions of critical shortage, drove out of the compound they had defended and disappeared down the road toward Camp Bastion. The district center was not being abandoned. It was changing hands once more. And the men taking over were about to discover, at considerable cost, precisely how much had changed in the weeks since anyone with fresh eyes had looked at the situation clearly. Major Lars Ulslev Johannesson, commanding the Danish Light Reconnaissance Squadron, took over the district center on the 26th of July and had approximately 24 hours before his first serious political crisis. On the morning of the 27th, a coalition airstrike targeting Taliban positions struck the mosque adjoining the compound and destroyed it. In another context, this might have been managed as a straightforward tactical incident. But earlier, in 2006, a Danish newspaper had published cartoon depictions of the Prophet Muhammad that had triggered riots across the Islamic world, leaving more than 200 people dead in the ensuing violence. Danish soldiers being responsible for the destruction of a mosque in a Pashtun Afghan town risked igniting consequences that stretched far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Johannesson convened a shura with the town elders the same morning, promised on behalf of the coalition that the mosque would be rebuilt at the coalition's expense, and in doing so, demonstrated once again the fundamental lesson that Musa Qala kept teaching to every commander who arrived there. The military and the political in this town were not separable categories, had never been separable, and could not be effectively addressed by separate means, by people operating in separate chains of command thousands of miles apart. The Danish forces brought substantial additional firepower to the garrison's defense. 140 men, 850 caliber heavy machine guns mounted on the sangars, providing all-round coverage, ramps constructed for their armored vehicles, allowing them to shoot over the compound walls at attacking forces. The Taliban fighters they encountered gave the Danes a name that appears in captured enemy communications from this period as a marker of genuine respect: the Tigers. It was not a compliment offered lightly by men who had been fighting for years. Yet even superior numbers and heavier weapons did not break the siege or meaningfully reduce the pressure on the compound. The insurgents adapted. They continued probing the perimeter, continued mapping the defensive positions, continued their patient accumulation of knowledge about exactly how the garrison could be killed. And on the 1st of August, 2006, the British made their second attempt to change the situation around Musa Qala. Operation Nakhod sent D Squadron of the Household Cavalry Regiment toward the town in armored reconnaissance vehicles, without the infantry support that operations in built-up urban terrain require, and the Taliban had been studying the likely approach routes for weeks. The ambush destroyed the leading vehicle with an improvised explosive device buried beneath the road surface. Captain Alex Ida was 29 years old, a Royal Horse Artillery officer whose commanding officer would later describe him as displaying real composure and huge professional competence in a novel, harsh, and unforgiving environment. He died in the initial detonation, alongside Second Lieutenant Ralph Johnson, 24 years old, and Lance Corporal Ross Nichols, 27 years old. Lance Corporal Nichols had already made the decision to leave the Army when this deployment came around. He volunteered for it anyway, because that was the kind of soldier he was. He left behind his wife, Angela, their 2-year-old son, Cameron, and a newborn daughter named Erin, whom he had held for only a matter of weeks before the orders came, and he had to go. The second armored vehicle that attempted to come to the aid of the first was itself destroyed by multiple rocket-propelled grenade strikes within minutes of arrival, forcing its crew to bail out into the open ground of the ambush killing zone. Corporal Mick Flynn took charge of the survivors on the ground and provided covering fire, while Lance Corporal Andrew Radford ran through the ambush zone twice, under fire both times, to reach a soldier who was burning in the wreckage and drag him clear of the flames. Both men were subsequently decorated for their actions in those minutes. The British drew their lessons from the failure of Operation Nakhod quickly and without sentiment. Armored cavalry operating without infantry cannot function effectively in built-up terrain where the enemy fights from buildings and rooftops at close range. The household cavalry was transferred immediately to the battle group command structure, ending the doctrine of independent armored operations in populated Afghan towns. The intelligence picture around Musa Qala was reassessed with clearer eyes. The Taliban did not merely occupy a few positions on the outskirts. They controlled the entire surrounding area with sufficient force to destroy a reinforced armored patrol. Nothing short of a full battle group operation could relieve the garrison. The planning for that operation began immediately. On the 6th of August, 500 British and coalition troops conducted the largest single operation in Helmand province since the deployment began. Royal Irish Regiment platoons and a paratroop platoon secured a landing zone west of the town for 3 Para's B and C companies. 300 soldiers advanced on the district center with fixed bayonets, a sight from an earlier century transported into the dust and heat of 21st century Afghanistan. Canadian armored vehicles broke through from the western approach simultaneously. Taliban positions nearest the town had been largely abandoned after sustained bombardment, and the advance met only sporadic resistance. The Pathfinders, who had spent 52 days in the field and were running on the particular grim determination of men who have been fighting too long, finally drove clear of the compound for the last time. Private Andrew Cutts of the Royal Logistic Corps was killed during the operation's withdrawal phase. A subsequent inquest by an Oxfordshire coroner concluded that he had probably been killed by friendly fire from British positions, a finding the Ministry of Defence acknowledged without particular emphasis, and one that appears in no formal commemoration of the battle. The Taliban returned within days of Operation Snakebite's conclusion. They had not been defeated. They had not scattered. They had moved temporarily out of range of the heaviest air assets, and then moved back in as soon as those assets were redirected elsewhere. The Danish Griffins held the compound alongside Royal Irish reinforcements, and the heavy machine guns on the Sangars made frontal assault prohibitively costly. The insurgents adapted again, shifting from massed infantry assault to long-range indirect fire, raining mortars and Chinese-manufactured rockets onto the compound from positions beyond the effective range of the garrison's direct fire weapons. On the 12th of August, Major Johannesson assembled the garrison and delivered the news every man there had been waiting to hear. They would be evacuating the position. General David Richards, who had taken command of the International Security Assistance Force on the 1st of August, had expressed clear dissatisfaction with the platoon house strategy and was prepared to authorize the withdrawal. Then the Afghan governor of Helmand appealed to the Prime Minister of Afghanistan. Political pressure from Kabul moved down through the coalition command structure, and the evacuation order was cancelled. The garrison stayed. The bewilderment among the men was difficult to conceal. Taliban control of the surrounding area had already made coalition patrols through the town essentially impossible, leaving Musa Qala itself entirely in insurgent hands, except for the district center compound. They were holding a single building in a town they had already lost, at the cost of continuous casualties, and the people who had the authority to end the situation had decided to continue it. On the 24th and 25th of August, the Danish Griffins withdrew from Musa Qala as scheduled. 8 50-caliber heavy machine guns left with them. The composite British force that remained was smaller, more lightly armed, and operating with a fraction of the firepower that had characterized the Danish phase of the siege. The Taliban, who had been tracking the garrison's composition and capabilities with the attention of professional soldiers, understood the reduction within hours. Probing attacks resumed before the dust from the departing Danish vehicles had settled. The composite force was designated Easy Company in the battle group's order of battle, an accident of the alphabetical designation system, a coincidence of history, and a name that would come to mean something specific and heavy when the next 3 weeks were finished. Major Adam Jowett had joined the British Army in 1991, commissioning into the Grenadier Guards before transferring to the Parachute Regiment in 1998, a deliberate choice made by a man who understood clearly which direction hardness lay in. He had served in Bosnia and Kosovo, the complicated, fragile aftermath of the Balkan Wars, in Sierra Leone during British evacuation operations, in Liberia, and in Afghanistan on a previous tour before this one. He had accumulated the kind of experience that cannot be taught in training facilities or replicated in exercises, the particular knowledge of what men look like when they are genuinely afraid, and what they look like when they have moved beyond fear into something more useful. The company he now commanded was not a unit in the traditional sense of that word. Easy Company was an improvised fighting force assembled at speed from different regiments with different cultures, different habits, different ways of moving and speaking and processing the information that combat produces. The Paras brought their specific identity, aggressive and self-reliant, and deeply suspicious of anyone who had not earned their qualification in the same way they had. The Royal Irish brought theirs, and the regiment's motto, Fa Abala, clear the way in Irish, shouted by Sergeant Patrick Masterson of the 87th Regiment at the Battle of Barossa in 1811, when he captured a French Imperial Eagle at bayonet point, carried a weight of inherited purpose that soldiers absorbed without needing to articulate it. Among the Royal Irish were men from Ireland, from Northern Ireland, and from Fiji. One of the Fijians was a 27-year-old ranger from Suva named Anare Driva, whose father had been a staff sergeant in the Royal Fiji Military Forces, and who had told his son to go higher, to reach further, to join the British Army, rather than staying close to home. Driva had listened. He was among the first soldiers in the battalion to volunteer for the Afghanistan deployment when the call came. The situation Jowett inherited required no elaborate briefing to understand. 2 50-caliber machine guns where there had been 8. A mortar ammunition supply that was already diminishing faster than it could be replaced. 6 resupply flights had reached the compound. In 40 days, of Danish occupancy. 6 flights in 40 days for a force of over 150 men in a combat environment where expenditure was continuous and the Taliban were attacking daily. The Chinook helicopters conducting those flights were large, relatively slow aircraft whose approach to the landing zone inside the compound was observable from every Taliban position in the surrounding buildings. The insurgents had studied the pattern of those flights carefully. They had registered their mortars on the landing zone with the methodical precision of gunners who understood that the helicopter was the compound's only connection to the outside world. The garrison's lifeline was a thread, and the people working to cut it knew exactly where and how it ran. Food was insufficient and monotonous. The men bartered with the few remaining locals willing to approach the compound, trading whatever they had for sheep, which they butchered inside the walls and cooked over whatever heat source was available. In the intervals between attacks, because the siege was not a continuous, unbroken battle, but a rhythm of violence and enforced quiet, a pulse of assault and silence that the men learned to read like a language. They made things. Bow and arrows for competitions held in the courtyard during the rare daylight hours when no attack was incoming. Gliders fashioned from materials found in the district center stores. A backgammon board made from mortar tube casing, signed by the men of Barossa platoon, now sits behind glass in the National Army Museum in London. It is the most eloquent physical object the siege produced, the proof that human beings under conditions of extreme sustained pressure will manufacture normalcy from whatever materials happen to be within reach, because the alternative to normalcy is a kind of darkness that professional soldiers are trained to refuse. What was not said openly in the compound, but was said quietly in documentary interviews conducted years after the men had left the army and could speak without institutional consequence, was that some of the soldiers of Easy Company had made a private calculation. They had assessed the distance to the nearest friendly force. They had estimated the speed at which a Taliban assault could close from the surrounding buildings to the compound walls. They had thought through what breaching those walls would take and how long it would require, and they had considered, clearly and without sentimentality, what Taliban captivity meant for a Western soldier captured in Helmand province in 2006. Some men had set aside a final bullet, not as a dramatic gesture, as practical planning conducted by professional soldiers who had looked at the mathematics of their situation and reached a conclusion that the mathematics supported. On the 1st of September, 2006, a Taliban mortar round found the Alamo. The 2 men on the roof of the prison at the moment of impact were Ranger Anar Driva and Lance Corporal Paul Muirhead. The round that killed them was not the product of random chance or lucky adjustment. The Taliban had registered that rooftop position weeks earlier, walking their mortar fire progressively closer to it over multiple separate engagements, adjusting their aim with each fire mission, accumulating data with the patience of men who understood that patience applied consistently enough becomes a weapon as lethal as any other. Anare Driva died instantly. He was 27 years old, the son of a man who had served his own country in uniform and told his son to go further and serve a greater one. The soldier who had arrived in Musa Qala with a smile undimmed, his commanding officer would later write, by the inhospitable surroundings. Lance Corporal Paul Muirhead, 29 years old, from the village of Barley in Warwickshire, was mortally wounded by the same detonation. His commanding officer's tribute described him as calm, confident, and determined, a man renowned among his peers for looking after the younger and less experienced soldiers in his section with a consistency and a care that revealed, beneath the quiet exterior, a man of considerable inner depth. His parents were flown to the military hospital where he was being treated. Paul Muirhead died on the 7th of September. 12 more soldiers were wounded in the same engagement. One Afghan police officer was killed on the same day, and 5 more were wounded. 3 men were dead. 12 were wounded. The mortar team had fewer than 30 rounds of 81mm ammunition remaining. The Taliban had achieved nothing in terms of capturing the compound. They were not finished. The attacks continued without any pause that could be called rest. 6 more British soldiers were wounded on the 2nd of September. 3 days after that, the Taliban attempted another coordinated mass assault on the compound and were driven back by ground attack aircraft, including American I-10 Thunderbolt jets, whose presence over Musa Qala in 2006 had become one of the more remarkable and largely unreported facts of the entire siege. The aircraft keeping Easy Company alive in what was formerly a British operation were American, from a force that was not officially fighting this particular battle. The sound of the Thunderbolt's cannon, firing 30mm rounds at a rate that makes individual shots indistinguishable from one another, produced a noise that veterans of the siege would describe in interviews years later as something that stayed with them permanently. In Musa Qala, in the late summer of 2006, it was the most welcome sound any of them had ever heard. On the 6th of September, a casualty evacuation helicopter was dispatched from Camp Bastion to extract 2 soldiers whose wounds had deteriorated beyond the capacity of the compound's medical resources to treat. The Taliban had been monitoring the garrison's radio communications with sufficient sophistication to understand what a casualty evacuation flight meant and when one was likely. When the Chinook made its approach to the compound's landing zone, they opened fire from every position with an angle on the approach corridor. The helicopter was forced to abort and return to Camp Bastion without completing the evacuation. On landing, the crew conducted a damage inspection and found 4 bullet holes in the airframe. 1 round had come within centimeters of severing a rotor blade. Had that round struck at a marginally different angle, or had the blade been at a fractionally different point in its rotation at the moment of impact, the helicopter would have gone down over Musa Qala, inside the Taliban encirclement, visible from every position the insurgents held around the compound. The propaganda value of a British military helicopter destroyed in flames over a besieged compound, and the effect of those images on British public support for the Afghan mission did not require elaborate calculation to appreciate. A second mission, dispatched later the same day with attack helicopters and a gunship providing continuous overwatch, finally succeeded in getting the wounded men out. By the 8th of September, the situation inside Easy Company's compound had reached a condition that military doctrine does not have precise language to describe. The mortar team was down to 30 rounds of 81mm ammunition. The general-purpose machine gun crews had exhausted their supply of pre-linked belt ammunition entirely. What those crews did in the hours between engagements was to locate individual rounds still present in the compound, 5.56mm cartridges left behind by the Danish forces when they withdrew, and thread them by hand into used ammunition belts, 1 round at a time, round by round, belt by belt, for hours, in conditions of exhaustion and heat, and the ever-present knowledge that the next attack could come at any minute, restoring by the labor of human hands what a factory produces by machine in seconds. This is what the siege of Musa Qala looked like from inside the compound in its final weeks. Not strategy, not air power, not the sophisticated counterinsurgency doctrine that had been written in comfortable offices by people who had not been here. Hands, rounds, empty belts, 1 at a time, in the dark. At the same time, the debate at the higher levels of the British military command structure had reached the point at which something had to give. Brigadier Ed Butler, commanding Task Force Helmand, had concluded that the garrison's position was no longer sustainable. British intelligence had confirmed that the Taliban had specifically identified the dependence on helicopter resupply and were planning to destroy a Chinook, not as a tactical objective in the ordinary sense, but as a propaganda operation designed to produce images of catastrophic British failure that would be broadcast around the world. The near miss of the 6th of September was not random. Butler presented his analysis to the Chief of the General Staff visiting Afghanistan, received authority to make his own decision, and on the 8th of September, Easy Company received word that they would be withdrawing within the next few days. General Richards opposed the withdrawal. His argument was grounded in Afghan history. In 1880, at the Battle of Maiwand near Kandahar, a British brigade was routed by Afghan forces and driven from the field with catastrophic casualties. The memory of Maiwand had persisted in the Pashtun South for more than a century as proof that the British could be broken if you hit them hard enough and held on long enough. Richards believed that an unconditional British withdrawal from Musa Qala, announced by the Taliban as the victory it would certainly be described as, would register in Helmand as Maiwand's modern repetition. The argument ran to the foreign policy advisor to the Prime Minister. It ran to the Chief of the Defense Staff. It was conducted in Kabul and in London, while 30 mortar rounds sat in a compound in the desert, and soldiers fed individual cartridges into empty belts by hand. And then the people of Musa Qala solved the problem that the generals could not agree how to solve. Neither side had won. The Taliban had lost more than 200 fighters, confirmed dead in direct assaults on the compound, and had failed in every serious attempt to capture it. Easy Company had held the position without breaking, without surrendering, without making the catastrophic tactical error that would have given the insurgents their decisive moment. But Easy Company was running out of the physical means to continue holding, and everyone in the compound knew it. Into this stalemate walked the people who had been paying the full price for the stalemate since July. Most of the town center had been destroyed in the months of fighting. Most of the population had scattered to surrounding villages, unable to trade, unable to harvest their crops before the autumn ended, unable to send their children to school or conduct any of the ordinary business of their lives. On the 26th of August, a woman and her child had been killed in the bazaar during a firefight between the garrison and Taliban fighters. The town's elders, men who had watched their community consumed by a battle that neither side had the ability to end on its own terms, held both sides equally responsible for what Musa Qala had become. They turned first to the Taliban and proposed that negotiations were the only path remaining. The Taliban had reasons of their own to listen. 200 confirmed dead, failed assault after failed assault, supply lines being cut in the desert by British armored patrols, a negotiated outcome allowing them to declare victory without having actually achieved it militarily was, assessed coldly, more attractive than continuing to spend men on an assault that the evidence suggested wasn't going to succeed. On the 12th of September, 2006, Brigadier Butler ordered a ceasefire. It took effect at 21 minutes past 9 in the evening. Not midnight, not a round number chosen for its symbolism, but the precise minute at which a command decision reached the end of the deliberation that had preceded it and became irrevocable. The following morning, 60 tribal elders walked through the gates of the district center. Jowett received them and assessed the seriousness of what they were proposing. In the afternoon, a shura was held in the desert west of the town. Butler and a Foreign Office representative sat across from the delegation of elders. Behind the elders, standing without taking seats, without speaking, without formally participating in the proceedings at any point, were men dressed entirely in black. Butler identified them as Taliban. They stayed at the back throughout the shura, and they did not object to what was agreed. The 14-point plan required the Afghan flag to continue flying over the district center. 60 members of the elders' own families to be constituted as a local police force, and reconstruction and development projects to proceed under the elders' authority. The elders promised to supply the garrison with food and water while the arrangements were implemented. They kept that promise. The market opened. The population came back. Children appeared in the streets of Musa Qala for the first time in months, in the particular way that children reappear in places where fighting has briefly stopped, cautiously at first, and then all at once. The extraction of Easy Company from Musa Qala took place on the 13th of October, 2006. The men departed not in military vehicles moving under fire, not in helicopters descending to a defended landing zone, but in jingly lorries, the decorated and chrome-ornamented trucks that have moved goods across Afghanistan's roads for generations, painted and personalized until no two look alike, so thoroughly part of the country's daily landscape that their use was itself a statement about what the elders were offering and what they were prepared to guarantee. On each lorry sat a tribal elder, present in person, guaranteeing with his own physical presence the safety of the convoy as it passed through his community's territory. The compound gate opened for the last time. The lorries moved out into the street. Not a single shot was fired at them. The convoy reached 42 Commando in the desert. A final shura was held. The elders were thanked for what they had done. The permanent coalition presence in Musa Qala came to an end. 3 days after the lorries drove away, the Taliban raised their flag over the district center and announced to anyone listening that they had driven the foreign invaders from Musa Qala. The Americans were furious. General Dan McNeill, who had replaced Richards as overall coalition commander, made no secret of his conviction that the deal was a strategic error. The Afghan parliamentarian Syed Mustafa Kazemi called it a model for the destruction of the country. The relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom over the conduct of operations in Afghanistan reached what one contemporary assessment described as an all-time low, a condition that would shape how the two allies operated together for the remainder of the campaign. The truce failed. In early 2007, the elders expelled Mullah Abdul Ghaffur, one of the commanders who had led the siege, for violating the terms of the agreement. A coalition airstrike then killed Ghaffur's brother and 20 of his followers in the surrounding desert. Ghaffur returned. On the 2nd of February, 2007, he led 200 to 300 fighters back into Musa Qala. The police were disarmed, government buildings were razed, and Haji Shah Aga, the elder who had organized the delegation of 60, who had sat in the Desert Shura and negotiated the agreement that brought Easy Company home alive, was taken from his house and executed in the street. Not for fighting, for talking, not for raising a weapon, but for believing and demonstrating with his actions that talking might be worth trying. A coalition airstrike killed Mullah Ghaffur 4 days after his return. The Taliban kept Musa Qala regardless. In December of 2007, 2,000 British troops and 600 American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division retook the town after 3 days of fighting. It had taken that force and that effort to retake what 88 men had held for 56 days and evacuated in decorated lorries. The full story of those 56 days was not told publicly for nearly a decade. The Ministry of Defense classified the operational details. Active duty soldiers were instructed not to speak to journalists or documentary makers about what had happened at Musa Qala. When a Channel 4 documentary team began assembling the account in 2016, they could only do so through veterans who had left the army, because those still serving had been told to stay silent. The ministry refused to provide factual information to assist the documentary. When the film aired, it was the first time most of the British public had ever encountered the name Easy Company, or the words, Siege of Musa Qala. The silence raised questions that the institutional memory of the British Army preferred not to answer publicly. Why had a reconnaissance platoon been used as a garrison force? Why had the garrison never received sufficient resupply to sustain the operation the chain of command was insisting they continue? Why were the men of Easy Company awarded fewer medals than the veterans who had served alongside them believed their service had earned and warranted? Stuart Tootle, who commanded 3 Para throughout the entire Helmand deployment and received the Distinguished Service Order for his leadership, returned to the United Kingdom to find that the soldiers wounded in his battle group were not receiving adequate medical support. He fought through the chain of command for them. When that produced insufficient results, he resigned from the army in public protest, established the 3 Para Afghan Trust charity to provide the support that the government was failing to deliver, and subsequently wrote the first account by a senior commander of what the Helmand campaign of 2006 had actually been, and what it had actually cost. Adam Jowett's own account appeared in 2018, 12 years after the siege ended. It became a Sunday Times bestseller. Martin Bell, the war correspondent and former member of Parliament, who had covered more conflicts than most generals had commanded, described it as the Rorke's drift of our times. The comparison to the 1879 battle, in which a small British garrison held a position against thousands of Zulu warriors, was accurate in the dimension of impossible odds and improvised defense conducted by men who had no realistic expectation of immediate relief. It was incomplete in one significant respect. The defenders of Rorke's Drift received 11 Victoria Crosses. The men of Musa Qala received a regimental march. In November of 2008, the Royal Irish Regiment was awarded the freedom of the borough of Larne in County Antrim, Northern Ireland. A new regimental march, composed specifically in their honor and named Musa Qala, was formally presented to the regiment. The Royal Irish were granted the right to march through the streets of Larne with flags flying, bands playing, and bayonets fixed. It is, measured against what the men did in that compound across those 56 days, the most formal official recognition the battle has ever received from any institution with the authority to offer it. British combat troops withdrew from Afghanistan in October of 2014, 8 years after John Reed promised 3. More than 450 British military personnel died in the conflict between 2001 and 2014. In August of 2021, the Taliban retook the entire country in 11 days. Musa Qala, the Fortress of Moses, the town where Honoré Driva and Paul Muirhead and John Hetherington died, where Alex Ida and Ralph Johnson and Ross Nichols died on the road, trying to reach it, where Haji Shah Aga was executed for the act of making peace, fell again without a serious fight. The Afghan flag came down for the last time. The poppy fields bloom every spring, regardless of who governs the land above them. John Reed stood in Kabul in April of 2006 and told the British public that their soldiers would leave without firing a shot. What the soldiers of Easy Company fired instead was a quarter of the British Army's entire annual ammunition allocation for Afghanistan. 88 men in a compound, in a town nobody in London had heard of before they were sent there, running out of everything except the discipline and the refusal that kept them at their posts when the rational assessment of their situation suggested something else entirely. The men held. The strategy that placed them there without sufficient force, without adequate resupply, without honest political understanding of what they were walking into, did not hold. And the distance between those two facts, between the quality of the soldiers and the quality of the decisions that committed them, is the distance in which the real history of the Afghan war is written. Paul Muirhead never came home to Barely. Anare Driva never came home to Suva. Ross Nichols never came home to Erin. The last British combat troops left in 2014. The Taliban came back in 2021. The 56 days that 88 soldiers spent threading ammunition by hand in the dark and holding a prison they called the Alamo and setting aside rounds they hoped they would never have to use, those days happened exactly as described here, were classified by their own government for years afterwards, and are still not recorded on any monument in London. If you believe those men deserve to be remembered, leave a comment below. And if you want to understand why the wars of the 21st century were lost before the first shot was fired, watch this next.